Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents On the Edge of Forever by Cahill, narrated by Lou Banks. Chapter 1. Canyon City, Colorado Territory, 1876. Something was wrong. James Wright rose from the desk, his paperwork forgotten. It was a scent, roast beef if he wasn't mistaken, that infiltrated the sheriff's office in Canyon City. He glanced down at his pocket watch. 7 o'clock. Well past time to lock the door and head upstairs to his supper obligation. He smiled at the thought. As one of 2 regular sheriff's deputies in town, he'd been the supper guest of the sheriff and his new wife more than once over the past few months. The taste of the food didn't always live up to the promise of its scent, but James enjoyed it nonetheless. After all, it was much better than whatever he could scare up himself, and the conversation was far improved from eating alone at the little restaurant across from the dry goods store. James pulled the shades and locked the door before making his way to the stairs in the rear of the building. The cells behind the stairs were mercifully empty for the first time in weeks. He climbed the narrow steps to the small living quarters on the 2nd floor, where he paused to knock, but the door flew open before his knuckles met the wood. "James!" Mrs. Young stood in the doorway, a large wooden spoon in her hand. "You are just in time." She left the door open as she disappeared through the room into the kitchen. 3 plates of meat, potatoes, and carrots sat on the table already, steam curling up from each one. Ben Young, the county sheriff and James's boss, stood from his seat. "I was about to fetch you from downstairs." He pushed a chair out, and James took it gratefully. "Lost track of time," James replied. His stomach rumbled, and it took all of his willpower not to grab the fork next to his plate. Finally, Mrs. Young reappeared, a gravy boat in her hands. James waited until Mrs. Young had said a prayer, and then gathered up his fork as fast as possible. He closed his eyes at the first bite. It was heavenly, and worlds different from the first time the Youngs had invited him to supper. A satisfied sound escaped his lips. "I take it that means you're enjoying the food?" Mrs. Young asked. "It's perfect," he replied. "Thank you for inviting me, Mrs. Young." She set her fork down. "For the love of all good things, James, you're to call me Penny." James nodded uncomfortably as Ben laughed. Mrs. Young, Penny, he supposed, never stood much on ceremony. "Anyway, it's much improved, isn't it?" Penny smiled at her husband and James. "The girls would hardly believe me if I told them I could cook something without scorching it or boiling all the taste out of it." "Do you see your friends often?" James asked, reaching for his glass of water. Penny had worked as a Gilbert Girl, a waitress, at the hotel in Crest Stone, south of Canyon City, before she married Ben. "Not recently, but they'll come up for church services now that the snow is melted. Although I suppose it won't be long before Crest Stone has its own church." "When that happens, you'll have to take the train down for a visit." Ben smiled at his wife. A few months ago, James never would have imagined Ben as a married man. And now here he was, easily settled into a new sort of life. It was a life James couldn't imagine for himself, as appealing as it seemed at times. He had plans for what he wanted to achieve as a lawman, and a woman would only serve to distract him. "The town's growing so quickly, I fear they may need someone like you there all the time," Penny said to Ben. "They'll elect a marshal once they're organized enough to consider such a thing," Ben replied. He sat back in his chair, finished with his meal, and fixed his gaze on James. "But it has been weighing on my mind since that train robbery last month, and now with all the newcomers arriving to help build, I've a mind to send someone down there to help keep the peace. James, you'd be the best choice for that. You want to go?" James paused in the middle of chewing his meat. This was the first Ben had mentioned of such an idea. He swallowed and lifted the napkin to his lips before responding. "You wouldn't need me here?" He forced himself to sound neutral to the idea, when in reality, he wanted to jump at the opportunity. He'd been a deputy here for going on 2 years. He'd saved up enough experience that he was more than ready to strike out on his own, be the sheriff or town marshal somewhere. Maybe this was that opportunity, coming to land in his lap without him even needing to lift a finger. I've got Harry, and if we need, I can always deputize Eli Jennings again. Heaven knows he's always asking, Ben said. Penny landed a stare on her husband that would have melted a lesser man. Ben cleared his throat and apologized to her for his choice of words, but with a smile so James couldn't tell if he was entirely sorry or simply appeasing his wife. In that case, James said, I'm happy to go as soon as possible. I must admit I'm a bit jealous that you're going to see the town grow. Just don't fall in love with any of the Gilbert girls. Penny aimed a mischievous grin at him. James laughed, even as he could feel his neck go red. I won't have time for anything such as that. Ben didn't either. Penny laid a hand on her husband's arm as she gave James an appraising look. You could use a good woman. James shoved a last piece of meat into his mouth. That was the last thing he needed right now. Ben shook his head. Leave the man be, he said before turning his attention to James again. I'll wire the hotel so they'll know to expect you. They spent the remainder of the meal discussing the growth of the town with lively interjections from Penny. When he left, James took a moment in the office downstairs to gather his thoughts before stepping out into the night to find his way home. This opportunity was exactly the sort for which he'd been waiting. Recently, he'd thought he might need to go seeking it out, but he'd been loath to leave a good position here in Canyon City for the unknown. Now it appeared he might be headed toward what he really wanted. Taking this work in Crest Stone was the logical next step. Were his uncle still alive, he would have slapped James on the back in congratulations and then told him not to mess this up. James smiled at the thought as he pulled on his coat. Uncle Mark had understood him in a way his own parents never could. He was the reason James had left the dull security of the family farm in Kansas for the uncertainty of life in the Colorado Territory. If James could be half the man his uncle was, he'd feel like he'd accomplished something good in his life. He'd go to Crest Stone and do the man's memory proud. And maybe by this time next year, he'd be Marshal Wright. Chapter 2. Crest Stone, Colorado Territory. Edie Dutton snuggled deeper into her coat as she closed the book she'd borrowed from Mrs. McFarland's small library. The hotel manager's wife, who served as the bookkeeper, was still kind enough to lend Edie books when she delivered dessert to Mrs. McFarland each evening. Although Edie didn't know why, she was grateful. In fact, most everyone at the hotel was friendly and kind to her, which was puzzling. She thought on it from time to time, but hadn't yet settled on why exactly. After all, it wasn't most folks who would continue to take kindly to a young woman who stole from their place of business, even if she had been blackmailed. As much as she could figure, it was simple Christian charity. She laid the book on the little garden table and scanned the trees that lined Silver Creek, which ran the length of the valley. It was early May, and spring was evident all around, even though the mountains that rose high above the creek were still a snow-covered white, almost blinding in the afternoon sun. Edie sighed. It wasn't often she felt entirely contented, but when she did, she wanted to seize the moment in the hopes it might last forever. "Oh, thank goodness!" A harried voice sounded from behind her, interrupting the fleeting peace. Edie turned and spotted Adelaide, who, at 16, was one of the youngest Gilbert girls at the hotel. Edie herself was only a couple of years older, but her own life at 16 had been so different from the one Adelaide was living. I must go to the mercantile, and Mrs. Ruby says I can't go alone given all those new men who have arrived. But everyone else is either working or otherwise occupied. Please, will you come with me?" Adelaide held up her hands as if in prayer, her big eyes sparkling in the sun. Edie might have laughed if she was given to such reactions, but instead she smiled. "You found me at a good time. I've only just finished my book, and I'm not scheduled to work this evening." Adelaide clapped her hands together. "Oh, thank you. I'm all ready. I've left my coat in the kitchen." Edie gathered her book and followed Adelaide inside. "I must return this to Mrs. McFarland, and then we can go." "I'll join you. What were you reading?" Adelaide finished shrugging into her coat and reached for the book. "Herbs and Medicinal Plants of the Colorado Territory. You do choose books that would put me right to sleep. I much prefer novels about dashing dukes and their ladies or pirates on the high seas. It's a pity Mrs. McFarland doesn't have any books like those." She handed the book back to Edie, who clutched it to her chest as she pictured Mrs. McFarland curled up with a dime novel about a pirate. A rare giggle came to her lips and almost escaped. The contentment she'd felt earlier must be going to her head to conjure up such images. "I enjoy learning about plants and trees." She paused a moment, wondering if she should share more, then plunged ahead. "I hope that as soon as the weather is warmer, I'll be allowed to plant a small garden." "Why, Edie Dutton," Adelaide said as they made their way through the busy hotel lobby. "I had no idea you were a farm girl." Edie's fingers tightened around the book. "I'm not. I mean, my mother tended a garden, and we had a few horses and goats and chickens, but no, my family aren't farmers." Adelaide didn't need to know most of those horses weren't really theirs, or that the goats and chickens were necessary, since they couldn't often go into town to purchase milk or eggs or meat, just like she didn't need to know anything else about Edie's previous life in Kansas. No one did. Mrs. McFarland was not in her office in the north wing of the hotel, so Edie slipped the slim volume into the pocket of her skirt. She'd come back later. She didn't dare try the knob to see if the room was unlocked. Not after what had happened earlier this winter, when that horrible Mr. Adkins had forced her to steal from the hotel to repay what he thought her pa owed him, or else have her darkest secret made public. It was a wonder Mr. McFarland had allowed her to remain employed as a Gilbert girl and hadn't put her on the next train back to Kansas. Not that she would ever return home. The girls returned to the expansive lobby, which bustled with guests, hotel employees, and men who had arrived in the valley since the snows had melted to begin building the town. Adelaide waved to Dora and Emma, two former Gilbert girls, who sat near the fire. Emma's hands rested on her growing stomach, while Dora held sheets of paper in her lap. Edie smiled at them. She was always hesitant to presume anyone was her friend, and although Dora and Emma had never been anything but nice to her, she feared they might see through her somehow. Particularly Dora, who had discovered Edie was the one stealing from the hotel. Yet Dora had remained ever kind, even after Mr. Adkins had held them both at gunpoint in the hotel's stables. "Emma tells me her baby isn't to be born until late June, although it looks to me as if it could arrive any day now," Adelaide whispered as they pushed open one of the large doors and stepped back out into the sunlight. "I cannot imagine ever having children. Can you?" Adelaide was forever making broad pronouncements such as this, and it amused Edie to no end. "Oh, I believe you'll have a whole passel of children, 7 at least, perhaps 10, she teased. 10? Adelaide pressed a hand to her heart. My mother had only my brother and myself, and she remarked often about how trying it was. Oh, it isn't so bad. Having so many children in a family, I mean. I have 5 brothers. Edie clamped her mouth shut. She never shared details about her family. What had possessed her to do so now? Adelaide shuddered. 1 brother was plenty for me. Having another 4 to boss me around sounds like a nightmare come to life. Edie searched in vain for a new direction of conversation. The last thing she wished to discuss was Adelaide's sheriff brother. She scanned the horizon from where they'd begun to walk down the hill toward the depot and the burgeoning town. "Oh, look," she said weakly. "What do you suppose that will be?" "Which one?" Adelaide asked. No fewer than 5 new buildings were under construction on both sides of the railroad tracks. "The one by the smithy shop?" Edie chose a partially constructed building at random. "A livery, perhaps? It would make sense to have it next to the blacksmith's." "It's awfully small to be a livery." Edie was truly curious now. In fact, the entire new town made her curious. It was a miraculous thing to see something arise from wilderness like this. When she'd first arrived, this place had felt so big and empty. Being from Kansas, she was used to wide open spaces, but to see an entire town emerge from such a place was an entirely new experience. It was fascinating to watch, but deep down inside, it made her nervous. More buildings meant more people, and she'd already had the misfortune to be identified by Mr. Adkins. Who else might arrive here if it turned into a proper town? Adelaide shot a grin at her. "Then let's go find out." The younger girl was nearly to the depot before Edie caught up with her. Edie picked her way across the railroad tracks and the mud lying on each side, her breath coming quickly from the unexpected sprint down the hill. "Pardon me." Adelaide was already calling out to the men working on the mystery building. A warm flush crept up into Edie's cheeks. Adelaide was overly exuberant at times, which could be endearing or, such as now, could be far too forward. "Adelaide!" Edie whispered loudly as she closed the steps between them. But Adelaide paid her no mind. "My friend and I are wondering what this building might be once it is finished. Could you tell us?" Adelaide smiled at the young man who'd answered her call, and he went a bit red. "It'll be the land office, miss," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "The railroad bought up all this land when it laid tracks." Edie let her eyes wander the partially built structure. It was hard to imagine these pieces of wood would turn into a building one could use. "Thank you, sir. You're doing a wonderful job," Adelaide said, as if she were in charge of the building. She tucked her arm around Edie's, and they started toward the Mercantile and General Store, which was only just south of the to-be-built land office. "Good afternoon, miss," the man called a half-moment too late. Edie knew if she looked back, she'd find the poor man watching Adelaide walk away. But as for Adelaide, the man and the land office were already forgotten. She steered them around some mud and said, "Oh, I hope Caroline has some lace handkerchiefs. She told me she would order some. My handkerchiefs are a frightful mess, and I must have at least 1 new one before we go to services in Canyon City on Sunday. Can you not edge a square of cotton if you're in such need?" All of Edie's handkerchiefs were plain cotton, and they served their purpose just fine. "I suppose, if I don't care to catch the eye of any fine gentlemen who happen to be at services, too." "And a lace-edged handkerchief will do just that?" Edie could hardly imagine any man even taking notice of a lady's handkerchief, much less whether or not the thing had lace. Her brothers were lucky enough to even remember to carry them. "Of course, if you hold it just so, as if you have a cough, it will frame your eyes very nicely." Adelaide pretended to hold a handkerchief to her face. Edie bit her lip. That was the most preposterous thing she'd ever heard, and she was about to tell Adelaide exactly that, and remind her that, as a Gilbert girl, she was forbidden from being courted anyway. But the girl had already pushed open the door and was halfway inside before Edie could speak. Caroline Drexel, a former Gilbert girl who ran the store with her husband, greeted them from behind the counter. While Adelaide nattered on about lace handkerchiefs, Edie pursued the store's shelves. The Drexels kept many items in stock for the hotel employees and train passengers. Edie could only imagine how their business would grow as the town did. She paused by a shelf holding an array of bottles, both small and large. The bottles were a rainbow of colors, and all bore labels proclaiming such things as Ivor's Cure-All for lungs, throat, and stomach, and Dr. Smith's Tincture for general health and well-being. Edie thought back over the herbs and plants she'd grown at home and the new ones she'd read about in Mrs. McFarlane's book. She tried to imagine herself brewing up some medicinal concoction so incredible people would demand it be bottled and sold in stores such as this. Miss Dutton's Elixir of Life. The name brought a smile to Edie's face, until she realized one tiny detail was incorrect. Dutton was not her surname. Chapter 3. James shaded his eyes from the sunlight as he took in the buildings under construction. There were 5, in various stages right now, with the foundations of 2 more looking as if they'd begin to take shape over the next week. He hadn't had the opportunity to visit Crest Stone before. Ben had spent a lot of time down here, particularly last fall when Royal Hagen's gang had taken his sister, but James had remained in Canyon City to keep the peace there while Harry and Eli had accompanied Ben. It was a pleasant enough spot, this burgeoning little town in the valley. Nestled near the foot of the Sangre de Cristos to the west, with the smaller wet mountains several miles to the east, it was picturesque, or at least it would be, once the construction was completed. Right now, it was a muddy mess. James had stopped at the hotel first to introduce himself to the proprietor. The man, one McFarland, had treated him to lunch, for which James was grateful, and had offered him a small room on the second floor of the hotel. After settling into his room, James decided to meet as many of the folks working on the new buildings as possible. He'd met Mr. Thomason, the depot clerk, who he learned also served as the postmaster and the telegraph operator. And now he'd come to the first building under construction, a small place next to an existing blacksmith's shop. Clanging sounded from the smithies, and James paused, pressing his eyes shut. The familiar ache pressed against his forehead, as if it were fighting to find a way out. It had been threatening ever since he'd left the hotel, but he'd ignored it. He didn't know how long it would be before it would render him utterly useless. It varied every time. He gritted his teeth, and for probably the millionth time in his life, wished for any other burden to bear than these headaches. The pain subsided to a dull reminder. The respite would be brief, he knew that. But he'd take advantage of the time he had before he'd need to pull the curtains in his hotel room and lie in bed. "Afternoon," a voice said. James's eyes flew open. The last thing he needed here was to look weak. He pasted a smile on his face, held out a hand, and introduced himself. "Afternoon. James Wright, Fremont County Sheriff's Deputy." The man narrowed his eyes for a half moment before smiling in return, removing his work glove and shaking James's hand. The look didn't bother James. He'd seen it time and again. It was most folks' natural reaction to learning his occupation, as they immediately wondered what he wanted with them. "Stephen Bauer. Good to meet you. Is there trouble?" "No, not at all. I'm down here to keep that from happening. I just got into town and thought I'd meet folks." He took in the wooden frame behind Bauer. "Will this be your establishment?" The man laughed. "Wish it were. This'll be the land office for the Colorado and New Mexico. They bought up all this land when they laid the tracks, and now I suppose they'll make money off selling it to people." James resisted pressing his fingers to his forehead as the pain pinged against his skull. Instead, he grabbed hold of the nearest post and ground his nails into it. "You work for the railroad?" Bauer nodded. "Not directly, though. You want Monroe Hartley. The railroad hired him to oversee construction of this place, same as some other interests in town. I think he's down that way." Bauer pointed south along the tracks, toward more new construction. "Good to meet you," James said. If he weren't pressed for time with this ridiculous infirmity, he'd have taken a few minutes to meet the other men working on the land office. But for now, he needed to move on and find this Hartley, and perhaps meet the proprietor of the general store and mercantile. The others would have to wait until tomorrow. He pressed on through the gritty mud that had formed between the buildings and the railroad tracks. The mercantile door opened as he walked around a particularly wide puddle, and out stepped a figure in a simple calico dress. An unbuttoned coat covered her shoulders, and a plain yellow hat adorned her head. She made a cheerful impression among the men and mud and wooden frames, so much so that he smiled in spite of the pain that had triggered again inside his skull. The woman had only just stepped away from the mercantile when James knew she was in trouble. "Miss, wait!" he shouted, but it was too late. One misplaced foot slid away from her, and before James could act, she'd landed on her hands and knees in the mud. He arrived at her side a split second after she fell and offered her a hand. "Are you all right?" Her voice trailed off as she lifted a mud-covered, gloved hand and stared at it for a moment. Instead of taking his hand with her own, she offered him an elbow. James took her elbow and, awkwardly, helped her rise from the mud. Upon standing, she looked down at herself and winced. "Thank you," she said so quietly he almost didn't hear her. "You're welcome," he replied. He wished he had something to offer her. A towel, perhaps, or... "I'll run into the mercantile and see if they don't have something you can use to clean off your dress." "No, please, don't." She looked at him now, her face tinged pink beneath the brim of her yellow bonnet and a pair of thin, silver-framed spectacles. She was only a few years younger than James himself, perhaps 18 or 19, and so slight it seemed she might blow away in the breeze if the mud weren't heavy enough to hold her down. He felt like a giant next to her. He paused, caught halfway between taking a step toward the mercantile and staring at the endearing blush on her cheeks. "Might I at least offer to—" "Oh, no! Oh, no, 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 no!" The girl leaned over and extracted something from the mud. James tilted his head as she shook some of the mess off a book. It appeared to be a slim, leather-bound volume, and he couldn't imagine why she'd be carrying such a thing about town. "It must have fallen from my pocket," she murmured as she tried to wipe off the remaining mud. It did no good at all, considering her gloves were both muddy. Her movements grew more frantic. She was certainly more concerned with the state of the book than the state of her clothing, as most women would be. Extracting a handkerchief from his pocket, James reached for the book. She held on to it for a moment, as if she didn't trust him with it, and then relinquished it when he held up the handkerchief. "Follow me." She trailed behind him as he made his way to the rear of the mercantile, where a small yard opened to a barn. James squatted down.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?